Hello everyone and welcome to episode 3 of Sparta Re-Examined. Today I am joined by Benny Trusker, who you met in the first episode, who is an expert and an archaeologist in ancient Greek warfare. And he also is the host of his very own YouTube channel, Historica Hellenike, which I will link down below. What happened to a Spartan warrior when he died in battle? So Benny, obviously being an archaeologist, you have a lot of experience with digging things up. And looking at things. So when we talk about burial practices for the Spartans, is the "with it or on it" slogan, is that accurate? Is that romanticized? What sort of was the typical burial ritual that would happen for a Spartan warrior who died in battle?
So yeah, no, it comes actually from Plutarch and the Stayings of Spartan Women. As we've all heard the story, whenever a Spartan mother was preparing her son for the eve of his first battle, she equipped him with a shield saying, "with this or on this." Now, the issue with that is we got to put ourselves back in the time period and understand the situation that was going on. If a Spartan is leaving the country, the city-state, the polis, if he is leaving his homeland to walk on foot miles elsewhere, they didn't have automobiles. They didn't have trains, planes, what have you. So the moment a Spartan, or just anyone, the moment someone dies, the body automatically starts decaying. So what they're saying is, well, according to Plutarch, what he is saying is that the Spartan youths that survived would pick up their fallen comrades, put them on the shield, and carry them back home with a warrior, honorable warrior hero burial type deal, right? The issue with that is, like I said, the body starts decaying at the moment of death. So now you have these bodies that are decaying, but on top of which, most battles that are fought in ancient Greece were fought in months of July, August, and September. Usually July and August. So that's hot. That's during the summer. It is very hot. So the body decomposition is going to, expedite. They're carrying these bodies miles, which I don't know if you've ever carried a dead body before, but whenever a body goes completely limp, it feels so much heavier than if it was alive, because the muscles are just limp, they're loose, they're free, and they things will move around, this and that, so it feels a lot heavier. It's a hard time carrying this body back to Sparta. So and all it most likely happened is, if the battle was fought in Sparta, yeah, they could probably be buried in Sparta, but most likely they were buried on the battlefield, whether they were being cremated and then burned together in a pit or with urns, or they are being buried in a mass grave. It's just the nature of the beast. So it's very poetic and it's a neat idea, but in actual practicality, most likely did not happen. Especially if you look at the Battle of the Champions, where one Spartan survived, and now he has to carry back the bodies of 299. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, luckily for him, the rest of the army did come back. So was it actually something that was definitely said to Spartans as almost a symbolic saying of the importance of the shield? That sort of die with this or survive with this or die with this as well? Or is the whole thing sort of Plutarch exaggerating?
It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but the idea is that, yeah, it's you either die defending your country or you come back having successfully defended your country. And in fact, another one of the sayings of Plutarch's Spartan women, which I find absolutely fantabulous, is from Plutarch's Sayings of Spartan Women, 241.5. A woman, when she saw her son approaching, asked, "How does our country fare?" And when he said, "All are dead," she picked up a tile, threw it at him, and killed him, saying, Then did they send you to bring us the bad news?" Wow, that's powerful. Because basically she's saying that our country lost a battle and you were a coward for coming home, and so she killed him so that he would die with the rest of his brothers.
That's extreme, eh? Wow.
Yeah. Now, granted, whether or not that actually happened, who's to say? But if that is true, that's what I would say hardcore.
We'll come across that way, I think. And sorry, who is the writer that wrote that?
That was also Plutarch.
Also Plutarch. Okay, interesting. So it's also interesting, of course, we've touched on this in other episodes of the series as well, but Plutarch is a significantly later writer to what we usually refer to as classical Sparta, right? So he's writing in the, I believe, roughly 300 AD is roughly when Plutarch's writing. So is it possible that this was a Spartan revivalist practice? Or is this also, does he mention that this is also a classical Sparta practice?
Well, truthfully, I don't know. I mean, so if I was to take a best guess, I would say this is an ode to heroes type deal, ode to days past. By the time of Plutarch's writing, Sparta had already been part of the Roman Empire, right? Empire with a lowercase e and then later capital E, right? So the actual need for Spartans to go to battle in the traditional way they had previously done probably doesn't happen as the way we would see fit, as we would think about the classical fighting, right? So I would say that when he went to Sparta, he probably heard these stories and probably heard the stories like, oh wow, that's something. Let me write this down. That could be a romanticism on the part of the Spartans themselves, talking about their glorious past. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's somebody is out there who does know, who's probably a lot more knowledgeable about it than I am. I focus primarily, like we discussed, on digging things up, or even just like the general history of Sparta. I'm not a poet. I don't know all the ins and outs and stuff like that. So, in my best guess, I would say this is like an ode to the heroic past. Additionally, I do want to take one more thing, a moment out. So I mentioned that she threw a tile, right? When people think of a roof tile or even a floor tile, they're not thinking of something very big or heavy. But we got to keep in mind, as an archaeologist, I've dug up so many roof tiles and floor tiles. These things are about yay big, like rectangular, about yay big, about that thick, made of clay. And if they're in one full piece, they're heavy. I mean heavy. So when people want to make fun of, say, like Pyrrhus of Epirus, when he was killed by having a roof tile thrown, hit him in the head, he's having a 15, 20-pound piece of clay thrown at his head. Yeah, I understand him being knocked off his horse. That's heavy. That hurts. So yeah. I can understand it killing somebody too.
Absolutely. And just jumping back to the whole Plutarch thing there, obviously one of the best games that we can play when it comes to trying to figure out Sparta is figuring out, is this a classical source? Is he talking literally or sort of symbolically? So lots of the time the answer, which isn't as exciting for people, is just that we don't know, which obviously poses issues, but also we can't really jump to conclusions such as this was this way, because we just don't have the sources to say whether it is completely. Right.
And another thing that, the one time that we probably do have a little bit of an idea, two instances specifically, comes from Plutarch's Lycurgus, 27.2 through 4. So he, Lycurgus, did not allow them to bury anything with the body, but they laid it out in a red cloak and olive leaves. When they buried it, it was not permitted to inscribe the name of the deceased, except for when the man who had died in war and a woman who died in childbirth. He fixed a short period of mourning, 11 days. On the 12th day, they had to sacrifice to Demeter and end their mourning. So, one thing archaeologically speaking, Dr. Paul Christensen, who is a fantastic Spartan historian, he wrote the typology and topography of Spartan burials from the proto-geometric to the Hellenistic period, rethinking Spartan exceptionalism and the ostensible cessation of adult intramural burials in the Greek world. That is a mouthful. But he wrote this article, and it's absolutely wonderful. And he looks at places that we have found burials, cemeteries and stuff like that, that belong to, like I said, the proto-geometric. So we're looking at roughly the early Iron Age all the way up to the Hellenistic period. So from circa 900-ish BC to about maybe 200 BC, 100 something BC. So, that's a long period.
Yeah, quite
So
a vast time period, yeah.
Yeah, and so we're looking at these different burials, and we find certain things that pop up, these themes. They're at the main hill that leads to the to the Spartan Acropolis, which has the temple of Athena Kali. I'm going to have a hard time saying this. The Athena Kali Oikos, which is literally the temple of Athena, or the bronze house Athena, or the Athena with a bronze temple. Different translations. Anyway, at the base of this hill, we find numerous, from the Archaic period even to the beginning of the Roman period, numerous bodies that when they were buried didn't have anything with them. And these were all men. So it kind of leads credence to this idea that, yeah, most likely these guys, when they were buried, they may have just had an actual cloak and olive leaves, and then they were buried at a sacred site. Additionally, we find elsewhere to the west of Sparta a cemetery that has a bunch of women, typically women that are in their 20s to 30s. So we can theorize that these women that died might have died during childbirth, and that they had their own special area in which they were buried. And thirdly, we actually have lists of Spartan burials, or rather Spartans that died in childbirth. And on these lists, we have some names of women. So again, this gives this idea that the women, when they died in childbirth, they died fighting their own war. They lost their war to produce children. Now, whether a child survived or not, that's different. But the fact that they died in trying to help the progeny of Sparta, that was the woman's war, was giving childbirth, because back then, child or infant mortality rate was so high. Childbirth was such an extreme, I don't want to say pain, because obviously nowadays modern day women giving birth are still in a lot of pain, but the experience of giving birth could theoretically kill a lot of women. I mean, a lot of women. I think the number was around like 4 out of 10 women could potentially die in childbirth in the ancient world. It was extremely high. Now, granted, most women, if they make it to the age of their 20s, their body has the best immune system. They're theoretically healthiest, physically fit, so their chances of survival goes up a lot. And so, giving birth, say the first time or the second time, potentially even the third, you'd be okay. But it's once you get to, say, the fourth, the fifth, or sixth, because women, they had a lot of children, and that's why we see in the ancient world a lot of men will take on second wives or third wives, because the first or second died in childbirth after giving birth to the third, fourth, fifth, sixth child. It's kind of sad. In a lot of instances, whenever they die, the father, whenever he remarries, will tell his surviving children from his first marriage or second marriage, this new woman that I've married is your new mother. You will refer to her as mother, and you will treat her as if she was your own biological mother. And vice versa. They would treat them as if they were their own children. Now, that's a bit of a digression, but the idea is that mortality rate back then was extremely high. Now, for the men that do have their names listed, it's most likely, again, the idea that these men were the men that died in battle. And that is probably the best way to honor them, because when it comes back, you know who's coming back from battle because you physically see them. And so they know who they sent out to battle. So now you can take a list and write down everybody who died, and you set up these stelae, or these stone plaques, or marble plaques that have a bunch of names saying, oh, Themistocles died in battle on this date, so-and-so, defending his country. And we know that a lot of other city-states, or polis, did so as well, such as Corinth, Argos, and especially in Athens, there at the Sacred Way in Kerameikos. So, yeah, I strongly believe that these lists that we have are war lists or burial lists for the war dead, because they couldn't physically bring them back to the country, and so the only other way you can honor them is by creating this large, grandstanded plaque that has their name that will live on in totality.
Right. Now, you mentioned something about they were buried with the bare minimum, so possibly just a cloak. Do you think that could be a throwback to when the youth were issued a cloak as their only form of wear through all seasons? Do you think that could almost be a throwback to going back to the basics of when you became a man in Sparta?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because when we think of Spartanism, right? I mean, it might be a coin term, I don't know, but I'm going to use it. Spartanism. When we think of the austerity of a Spartan or going Spartan, we think of somebody who lives a very minimalistic lifestyle. So, this idea of, say, Spartans being in extravagant clothes and stuff, well, that's just non-existent. No one thinks that because our records say that they didn't. Up until the Peloponnesian Wars, whenever Persia started funding Sparta with physical coinage, Sparta didn't have coins, and they, their wealth was through their grain and their wine production, stuff like that, through the helots or the perioikoi, their own plots of land to help with their sestia. So, yes, the minimalistic approach, I think, is just showing that even in death, they are living as a Spartan. They may not have died in battle, but they are living as a Spartan in the way in which, by being clothed in just cloaks. Now, we could also try and think of a different approach in the sense that, okay, Spartans were the aristocrats. We all know this. We all know that the Spartans were the ones with the bronze, the weapons, the armor, etc. We also know that bronze in the ancient world is one of the most expensive metals, alloys, materials, etc. Whether it's for production of, say, maybe nails or keys or pottery, etc. Not pottery, but pottery. We do have bronze vases and bowls and stuff like that. But specifically for war-related items, such as the sauertir on the butt spike of a spear, or the helmets and of course the bronze cuirass, right? So we have all this bronze, and we know that it's extremely expensive. And to have all this bronze for the war-related items is a symbol of wealth. So because of its rarity, I imagine, or we could theoretically could imagine that what is going on is, instead of burying it with the Spartan, to show just how wealthy they were, but they're trying to not show how wealthy they are, but additionally, this is extremely valuable material, let's reuse it. We could give it to his son or grandson or whomever, or if push comes to shove, we can melt it down, reforge it into something else.
There's an interesting thought. I'm not sure about the remelting of armor to remake armor necessarily, because I have a few blacksmith friends. Basically, if you melt down metal, you don't get the same amount back, right? You lose lots of it. So I can imagine that if you get a super outdated helmet, you can melt it down to create maybe a Sartor that uses less bronze. But I couldn't necessarily imagine that you'd melt down armor to create more armor. But I do definitely see what you mean by the passing the armor on as opposed to burying it with the soldier. And that could also explain why we have relatively few finds of... well, I guess we don't have relatively few. We have quite a lot, but compared to how many hot plates there were, we have relatively few finds of armor. Which could indicate a high level of reusing or recycling, essentially, of armor. One question I have here is, so we know that the women died in childbirth and the men who died in combat. Was there a specific way that they used to identify the men who died in combat? Was there a form of, like, the modern military has dog tags? Do we have any evidence for the Spartans using a similar sort of method of identification?
There is one system in which we have, I guess you could say, like a toe tag or a dog tag. So in the Battle of Mantinea in 418 BC, we have records that the Spartans had wooden blocks with their names that were, tagged to their arms, or, as like a necklace or something like that. That way, if they died, whoever survived would pick up these blocks and like, okay, well, we know who died. That's how the story goes. Obviously, we don't have these wooden blocks because wood deteriorates over time. They could also, very perishable. They could throw it in a fire, etc. So we can't 100% validate whether or not that actually happened. Now we have, like I said, in the written record. So I think it's very plausible, but it could also be a one-off event. Like I said, we know about it in 418 at Battle of Mantinea, but we don't really hear about it in any other battles or elsewhere. We don't even hear from, say, like Xenophon or anything like that. He never mentions anything like that.
Alright, interesting. Okay, so it's possible, but the evidence is only mentioned in one occasion.
And if it did happen, it seems like it would have most likely happened in a very specific instance or a very limited capacity.
Right, so essentially then, if we've sort of come to the conclusion that Spartan women were buried sort of in Sparta, but Spartan men were buried abroad, So do we have lots of sort of finds of Spartan burial mounds outside of Sparta in battle sites, or like sort of what's the archaeological record of Spartan burial?
So the archaeological record is that we have very little, specifically when it comes to Spartans. But additionally, you mentioned the burial mounds. Burial mounds actually was the exception to the rule and not the rule itself. So when we think of, at Marathon, right, or even in Euboea, there's a burial mound of the Athenians there too. That was the exception to the rule and not the rule itself.
Oh, really?
Because up until that point, burial mounds were not a thing. They were burned, and their ashes could have been carried back to. That's another thing that could happen. Their ashes could have been carried back after they'd been burned and given to the families to dedicate to their own private shrines, etc. So theoretically, with Sparta, they could have followed that similar instance of they burned the bodies, could have collected the ashes and returned them home, or what could also have happened, which happened quite often with multiple poleis, is that they would just simply bury them. Because when we think of inhumation, we think that, in Sparta, or not Sparta, sorry, we think of Greece as, they cremated the bodies. They always cremated the bodies, or they put, the gold coins over the eyes. Cremation came and gone as like a fluctuating practice for burial. But additionally, the whole idea of, like I said, the coins on the eyes, that happened for maybe about 100 years in the part of the Hellenistic period leading into the Roman period of Greece. But even then, less than 10% of burials in that time actually had coins on their eyes or around the skull.
Oh, right. So as far as I'm aware, I'm not too versed in my mythology knowledge for ancient Greece, if I'm completely honest. But is that coin to pay the ferryman, is that a myth, or is that actually what that sort of drachma over the eye was for?
Well, we do see it pop up in Homer's Iliad, right? Of, say, anybody who dies on the battlefield and stuff like that, they're buried with gold coins. And that's, the pay the ferryman. So it does pop up in myth, and theoretically it could have happened, say, with like the Minoans or the Mycenaeans, because when we look at the archaeological burial sites for the Minoans and Minoans and the Mycenaeans, we do see quite a bit of coins being buried with the body, but they're not near the head. They're usually near the waist or towards like the bicep near the arm, but not usually by the head. So, to my understanding, it could have been a tradition that Homer had heard about from the Mycenaeans, but most likely it was just, it could have, like I said, it just could have been like a passing story that he heard, and so he incorporated it, but in actual practice throughout the Archaic up to the Hellenistic, not really a thing. So we also have a possible idea of what other people thought of Spartan burials, one of which is the tomb of the Lacedaemonians in Athens, there at the Sacred Way in the Kerameikos. So at the Peloponnesian War, we have 20 Spartans that were killed during the year of the tyrants, so the 30 tyrants, right? So the Athenians that survived, in homage of the Spartans, they built this large marble tombstone, I guess you could say, and inside had the actual Spartans that were buried. And additionally, when they wrote down, here lie the Spartans had died so-and-so, and here are their names, they wrote it from right to left, because the Athenians thought that the Spartans wrote from right to left. But when we actually look at a lot of Spartan writings, it's left to right. So even among the Athenians, they thought they were giving Spartan burials, but what we know about the Spartans is they didn't like big, giant, grandstanding memorials. They had their stelae for the names and stuff, but comparatively, it's very bare and minimalistic because that's just not who they were. So if you look at this tomb of the Lacedaemonians in Athens, it's very much an Athenian interpretation of what Spartans were, or how their burial practices were. And it's incorrect. I mean, Spartans could have written from left to right and then back to right to left because, there's a continuous script. But most likely, it was probably just left to right.
Okay, so basically to sum it up then, the whole with it or on it sort of symbolism of Sparta wasn't necessarily realistic in the expectations of what we would assume a Spartan warrior would go through if he died in combat. it's possible that his ashes or a part of him was returned back to Sparta, but the actual burial practice was usually abroad, or he was cremated abroad. And it was quite a minimalist sort of, we will remember your name, but otherwise it's no grand sort of memorial to you. As again, as you said, the Spartans were quite minimalist and not particularly arrogant in their attitudes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, to be a Spartan is to be austere, and like Kyrgyz, you have 11 days to grieve. I have grieved loved ones for years after they passed away, not just 11 days.
So thank you very much, Benny, for your insight on this burial sort of ritualistic side of Sparta that lots of people have very misinterpreted views on. I learned a lot about this as well. To be honest, I haven't delved into this too much, so thank you very much for your time and your saying that. Again, please go and check out Benny's channel, Historica Hellenike. I'll link the description down below. And thank you for joining me today. And I hope you enjoyed Sparta Examined Episode 3. If you haven't checked out the rest of the series, I'll also link that down below.
Thanks, Adam.